I've been a trucker for over a decade now, and I've had my fair share of strange experiences on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for that night at the gas station off Route 76. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I was bone-tired. I decided to pull into the small, dimly lit gas station to get some shut-eye. The place was practically deserted, just an old rusting sedan and my rig. I parked my truck, climbed into the sleeper cab, and locked the doors. After setting the alarm on my phone for 6 a.m., I lay down, letting the hum of the engine lull me to sleep. It wasn't long before I drifted off, but my slumber was far from peaceful. A loud thud jolted me awake. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, straining to hear over the thumping of my pulse in my ears. At first I thought it might have been a raccoon or some other animal, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. Someone was trying to break into my truck. I sat up and peered through the small window into the darkness. The interior lights were off, and outside, the only illumination came from a flickering neon sign and a single overhead light. That's when I saw him. A shadowy figure was crouched by the passenger door, a crowbar in hand, prying at the lock. Fear shot through me. My first instinct was to start the engine and drive off, but then I realized I'd have to climb into the driver's seat, which would expose me. I decided to stay put, hoping he'd give up. But he didn't. The man was persistent, and soon the lock gave way with a sickening crunch. The door swung open, and he climbed inside. He was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in dirty, ragged clothes. His eyes were wild and unhinged, darting around the cab before settling on me. A twisted smile spread across his face as he held up the crowbar, tapping it lightly against his palm. "Hello there," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Looks like we're gonna have some fun tonight." I tried to stay calm, thinking of ways to get out of this situation. "Listen, man, I don't have any money," I stammered. "Just take whatever you want and leave." He shook his head, the smile never leaving his face. "Oh, it's not about money. It's about the thrill." He moved closer, the crowbar now swinging casually in his hand. "You see, I like to play games." My mind raced. There had to be something I could do. The man was between me and the driver's seat, so making a break for it wasn't an option. I needed to stall to keep him talking. "What kind of games?" I asked, trying to sound interested rather than terrified. His eyes lit up and he chuckled. "You'll see, but first, let's get to know each other better." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of rope. Hands out, nice and easy. I had no choice but to comply. He tied my hands together with surprising skill, the rope biting into my wrists. He then forced me to sit on the edge of the sleeper bed while he rummaged through my belongings, tossing things aside carelessly. He found my phone and pocketed it, cutting off my only means of calling for help. "Now the fun begins," he said, sitting down opposite me, the crowbar resting across his knees. "We're going to play a little game of truth or dare. If you lie or refuse a dare, well..." He tapped the crowbar. "You get the idea." The next few hours were a nightmare. He made me tell him about my life, my family, my fears. Every time he didn't like an answer, he'd swing the crowbar, hitting the walls and seats, coming perilously close to my head. The dares were worse. He made me do humiliating things, all while laughing maniacally. By the time dawn began to break, I was a broken man. My wrists were raw from the rope, my body ached from the constant tension, and my mind was frayed from the terror. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, he stood up, stretched, and yawned. "Well, this has been fun, but I think it's time I moved on," he said, his tone casual, as if we just finished a friendly chat. He leaned in close, his breath hot and rancid on my face. "Remember this night, friend. I know I will." With that, he climbed out of the truck, leaving the door ajar. I waited until he was out of sight before struggling to untie the rope. My hands shook as I fumbled with the knots, but eventually, I was free. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. When they arrived, the man was long gone, leaving no trace behind. The officers took my statement and searched the area, but it was clear he'd planned his escape well. They told me I was lucky to be alive, and I couldn't argue with that. To this day, I can't sleep in my truck without thinking about that night. Every noise, every shadow sends a jolt of fear through me. I've changed my routes and avoid stopping at isolated gas stations, but the memory of that man's twisted smile will haunt me forever. Driving long-haul routes, I've seen my share of strange things. When you're alone in the cab of an 18-wheeler, the vast stretches of American highways can play tricks on your mind. But what happened to me on Route 91 autumn night was no trick of the mind. It was all too real. I had picked up a load of refrigerated goods from a warehouse in Spokane and was bound for Portland. It was around 11 p.m. and the highway was eerily deserted. The occasional headlights of a passing car or the dim glow of a distant farmhouse were my only companions. The night was cold and a dense fog had rolled in, turning the road into a shadowy tunnel. As I made my way through the winding stretches of the road, I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. They seemed distant at first, just another vehicle on the road. But as the minutes passed, those headlights grew closer, cutting through the fog like knives. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Perhaps another trucker, or maybe a late-night driver in a hurry. But as the vehicle approached, I realized it wasn't just any car. It was an old black tow truck, the kind that looks like it belongs in a junkyard rather than on the road. There was something off about it. The truck's paint was chipped and rusted, and its headlights flickered erratically. Despite its decrepit appearance, it moved with an uncanny speed, closing the distance between us alarmingly fast. I felt a chill run down my spine as the tow truck settled in behind me, its headlights almost blinding in my mirrors. I adjusted the mirror to reduce the glare, but that didn't shake the sense of unease growing inside me. My mind raced with questions. Why was this tow truck following me? Was the driver in some kind of trouble, or was it something more sinister? After several miles of the tow truck sticking to my bumper, I decided to speed up. I pushed my rig to its limits, but the tow truck matched my speed effortlessly. I glanced at the speedometer, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour, but the black tow truck stayed right behind me, its engine roaring like a beast in the night. Fear turned to panic. I scanned the road ahead, hoping to spot a gas station or rest stop where I could find some help, but the fog obscured everything. The highway seemed endless, an asphalt river flowing into the unknown. My mind flashed back to the stories I'd heard from other truckers about the haunted stretches of highway, about phantom vehicles that appear out of nowhere and chase unsuspecting drivers. I had always dismissed them as tall tales, but now, with the black tow truck tailing me relentlessly, I wasn't so sure. Suddenly, the tow truck swerved into the left lane, pulling up alongside me. I dared a glance to my left and saw the driver for the first time. He was a gaunt figure, his face hidden in shadow except for his eyes, piercing, glowing eyes that seemed to burn with malice. He grinned at me, revealing a set of yellowed, crooked teeth. The sight sent a jolt of terror through me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The tow truck edged closer, the side of its rusty frame scraping against my rig. Sparks flew, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air. In a desperate attempt to shake him off, I swerved to the right, narrowly avoiding the guardrail. The tow truck fell back momentarily, but it quickly regained its position beside me. The driver's maniacal grin never wavered. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of a way out. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of civilization in sight. The fog thickened, wrapping the road in a suffocating blanket of gray. Then, up ahead, I spotted a sign rest area 1 mile. A glimmer of hope flickered in my mind. If I could just make it there, maybe I could find some help, or at least lose the tow truck in the parking lot. I floored the gas pedal, my truck barreling down the highway. The rest area appeared through the fog like a beacon, its dim lights barely cutting through the murk. I veered off the highway, my tires screeching as I pulled into the parking lot. To my horror, the tow truck followed me in, its engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. I drove around the lot, searching for a spot to hide or a way to escape, but the tow truck was relentless. In a last-ditch effort, I swung my rig around and faced the tow truck head-on. I honked my horn, a deafening blast that echoed through the night. The tow truck halted, its headlights illuminating the front of my rig. The driver stared at me, his eyes burning with an unholy light. For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in a standoff. Then, without warning, the tow truck's headlights flickered and went out. The engine died, and the truck sat there, lifeless and dark. I waited, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the driver didn't move. Slowly, cautiously, I climbed out of my cab and approached the tow truck. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like walking through a nightmare. When I reached the truck, I peered inside. The driver's seat was empty, no sign of the gaunt man with the burning eyes. The cab was filled with an oppressive silence, as if the truck had been abandoned for years. I backed away, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get out of there. I jumped back into my rig and sped out of the rest area, not daring to look back. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night on Route 97. Was it a ghostly encounter, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely? All I know is that the black tow truck and its sinister driver haunt my dreams, a reminder that the open road holds more than just miles of asphalt. It holds secrets and terrors that defy understanding. Driving a rig on long-haul routes isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. I've seen every corner of this country from the cab of my truck, and the road has been my home for the better part of 2 decades. But there's one night that stands out, one that haunts me to this day. It was a chilly autumn evening, the kind where the fog settles low and thick over the asphalt, making the world outside the cab feel like a distant, ghostly memory. I was headed west on I-70, somewhere in the vast nothingness between Kansas and Colorado, when I spotted her. She was standing on the shoulder, her figure barely visible through the mist. My headlights illuminated her just enough to see she was wearing a tattered coat, her hair wet and plastered to her face. It wasn't uncommon to see hitchhikers, but something about her made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way she stared directly into my eyes, even through the windshield. Still, I've always believed in helping those in need. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and asked if she needed a ride. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she thanked me and climbed in. The cold air followed her into the cab, making me shiver. "I'm heading west," I said, trying to make conversation. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away, just stared out the window. After a long pause, she said, "Anywhere but here." We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional blare of a horn from passing cars. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then, just as we were passing a rest stop, she turned to me and said, "Pull over." Her tone was different now, commanding and cold. I glanced at her, my heart pounding. "Why?" She didn't answer, just reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. My blood ran cold. "Pull over," she repeated, pressing the barrel to my ribs. I did as she said, my mind racing. The rest stop was deserted, the flickering neon lights casting eerie shadows over the empty parking lot. As soon as I stopped the truck, she grabbed my keys and tossed them out the window. "Get out," she ordered, waving the gun towards the door. "And don't try anything stupid." I complied, my hands shaking. As soon as I stepped out, a second figure emerged from the darkness. A man, burly and menacing, approached the truck with a predatory grin. He climbed into the cab and started rifling through my belongings. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take whatever you want. Just let me go." The woman laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Oh, we will. But not until we're done." The man found my wallet, yanking out the cash and tossing it to the woman. He pulled out my phone and smashed it against the pavement. I felt a surge of anger and fear, but I knew better than to make a move. They took their time, rummaging through my things, occasionally glancing at me with those cold, calculating eyes. I stood there, the night air chilling me to the bone, praying they'd leave soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man climbed out of the cab, holding my spare keys. He tossed them to me, a sneer twisting his features. "Get lost," he said. "And if you call the cops, we'll find you." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled back into the cab, my heart racing, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them disappearing into the fog, their figures swallowed by the night. I drove for hours, my mind replaying the events over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on me, the cold barrel of the gun against my ribs. I finally pulled over at a well-lit truck stop, surrounded by other truckers, and let myself breathe. I reported the incident to the police, but I knew the chances of them being caught were slim. They were ghosts on the highway, predators lurking in the fog, ready to pounce on the next unsuspecting driver. To this day, I can't drive that stretch of I-70 without feeling a knot of dread in my stomach. The road is a dangerous place, and sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in our imaginations, but the ones we meet in the dead of night, standing on the shoulder, waiting for a ride. It was just another late-night drive on an American highway. I'd been driving rigs for nearly 2 decades, seen everything from blistering desert heat to bone-chilling snowstorms. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded on this particular trip. It all started with a seemingly ordinary advertisement. Urgent load transport needed, high pay. The pay was too good to pass up, and the route seemed straightforward. Pick up a load from a small town in Arizona and deliver it to a warehouse in Nevada. The contact, a man named Carl, assured me it was a simple job. I didn't ask too many questions. I just saw the dollar signs. I arrived at the pickup location late in the afternoon. The place was a dusty, run-down warehouse at the edge of town. Carl, a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, greeted me with a firm handshake. The cargo was already loaded, a series of large, unmarked crates. I asked what was inside, but Carl just smiled and said, "Just deliver it on time and you'll get your pay." I should have known then that something was off, but the lure of easy money dulled my senses. I signed the paperwork, climbed into my rig, and set off as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The highway was quiet, and the hum of the engine was almost soothing. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone's eyes are on you. I chalked it up to paranoia and kept driving. Around midnight, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. They'd been following me for the past half hour, maintaining a steady distance. I switched lanes, and so did they. I slowed down, and they matched my speed. My gut tightened. Something was definitely wrong. I picked up my CB radio and called out to any nearby truckers. "Hey, anyone out there? I think I've got a tail." Silence. Not a single response. The realization hit me. I was alone on this stretch of road. I decided to test my theory. I took the next exit, a dark, deserted road leading into the desert. The car followed. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get away. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as I sped down the empty road. The car's headlights grew closer, and then I saw more lights ahead, 2 more vehicles blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. The car behind me stopped, and the occupants got out. 3 men, all dressed in black, approached my rig. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my cell phone, but there was no signal. "Get out of the truck!" one of the men shouted, banging on the driver's door. They were armed. I had no choice. Hands shaking, I opened the door and stepped out. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The load," the man replied, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "Just give us the keys and no one gets hurt." I tossed them the keys. They climbed into the cab and started the engine. I was left standing on the side of the road, helpless as I watched my truck and the valuable cargo drive away. They didn't bother to tie me up or even rough me up. They simply took what they wanted and left me there in the middle of nowhere. I stood there for what felt like hours, stunned and terrified. Eventually, I started walking. The nearest town was miles away, but I had no other option. It was nearly dawn by the time I stumbled into a gas station. I called the police, but there was little they could do. The truck and the load were long gone, and the criminals left no trace. I never found out what was in those crates or why they were so valuable. Carl disappeared. The phone number he gave me disconnected. I was left with nothing but questions and the lingering fear that someone was still watching me. That night changed me. The highway, once a place of solace and freedom, now felt like a trap. I still drive, but I'm more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of those cold, predatory eyes in the darkness. The money wasn't worth it. Nothing ever is when your life is on the line.